Welcome everybody to the first webinar of the Covidence UK study. My name is Adrian Martineau. I'm Professor of Respiratory Infection at Queen Mary University of London, and together with my colleagues here on screen we'll be giving you an update on progress with the study and our future directions. Before we get going, I just want to acknowledge the input of the 21 people from 5 different universities who've made this project possible. I won't name them all, but I'm very grateful to everyone for their input. I'd also like to thank the many supporters of our project, some of whom are listed here. In terms of the structure for the webinar, first of all, Hayley Holt, one of our principal investigators, will describe who signed up to the study. Then two of our participants, Bill Day and Abdul Abubakar, will give their perspectives on what it's like to take part in the study. Our statistician, Mohammad Talaei, will then tell us how he has calculated or estimated who has already had COVID. Professor Seif Shaheen, our study epidemiologist, will then provide some early data on risk factors for susceptibility. And finally, I'll answer some of the questions you've sent in and talk about next steps. So without further delay, I will hand over to Hayley for the first session. Thank you, Hayley.
Great. Well, first of all, I'd like to welcome everyone and thank you guys for joining us today. So first, I'd like to briefly talk about the aims of our study. The first of which is to identify and understand the risk factors for COVID-19. Secondly, we're going to be looking at how quickly do people recover from COVID and whether or not there may be any long-term impacts. Thirdly, and most uniquely, we're looking to establish a platform to fast-track future clinical and research trials for COVID-19. And lastly, we're going to be looking to evaluate the impact of COVID-19 on physical and mental well-being. So next, I'd just like to give you guys a little insight to how our recruitment has gone so far. So this is the graph of how we've been doing since our launch on May 1st. And when we launched, we had a few articles in the Express newspaper. And following that, we've had quite a few other media engagements, namely some radio from BBC, and also some spots on BBC World News, BBC Northwest, and BBC Midlands. And all of that has kind of helped us. Today, we have 7,898 participants out of our goal of 12,000. And we really are overwhelmed with the support that we've gotten so far. So we just have to thank all of you again for showing your support for this study. I'd like to give a bit more detail about the demographics of the study. So we are 68% female, 32% male, which compares to the UK national average of 51% of the female population in the UK and 49% male. So a really pretty good distribution. If we look at recruitment by country, we have majority of people from England, just over 5,000 people. 314 from Scotland, 239 from Northern Ireland, and 271 from Wales. And really interestingly, we created a heat map of the Covidence UK recruitment, and that's what you'll see on the left-hand screen here. So this is where all of our participants are from, and if you compare that to Public Health England's reported COVID cases per local area, you can see that our recruitment is quite similar to where you've seen a majority of cases, which is really interesting as well, because a lot of times when people join a study, it's the worried well people that join it. But it's really good to see that we are hitting these areas that are being most impacted by COVID. So then we're going to look next about the age distribution of the people in the study. You can see that the majority of our participants are over the age of 50 years old, which is really nice to see, because people over the age of 50 are at increased risk. So it's really important for us to be able to identify these risk factors that are most going to be impacting this group particularly. Next, we're going to look at the breakdown of ethnic origin within our study. So as you can see, we're 95% white participants. And now the national average in the UK is 14% of BAME populations, whereas we only have 3% represented in our study. And I'm sure that you've heard on the news that ethnic minorities are disproportionately affected by COVID-19. And in order for us to really understand why that exists, we need more recruitment in this area. Public Health England recently released some initial reports on ethnic minorities and COVID, and they revealed that Bangladeshi population is 2 times as likely to die of COVID, and the Black population is 50% more likely. So we really do need increased recruitment in this area in order to start answering questions about why COVID is disproportionately affecting these groups. And then next, we're going to hear from some Covidence UK participants. So first, we'd like to hear from Bill. Bill, if you would like to explain firstly what motivated you to join the Covidence UK study.
Okay, fine. Yeah, but I thought the main focus of scientific research seems to be quite rightly aimed at finding a vaccine and steering the population as safely as possible through the current pandemic. A vaccine, however, may well be years away and quite possibly not effective enough on its own for everyone to resume normal life. Covidence studies taking a more holistic approach, it seems, to the longer term problem, trying to establish why the groups of people deemed most at risk and asked to shield are so vulnerable to the virus, and also investigate ways that these people and the general population are able to lower their own risk through lifestyle changes. COVID-19 being a brand new virus of which very little is known as yet, so all of our assumptions about general healthy living preventing the illness may not be true and need to be investigated. The study also looks into the long-term impact of the virus on people's health over a longer period. Focus at the moment, again, rightly, is on treating people in the short term to help them recover from the illness, but it's not known what lasting effects the disease may have on people. So as this study is over 5 years and open to people who have had the virus as well as those who have not, it should give a good indication of ongoing health problems. I'm a person who is on the shielded list, so I'm keen to get my life back to as normal as possible, as quickly as possible. Contributing to this study seems an easy way to help the researchers get a better understanding of COVID-19 and help all of us resume our normal lives as soon as possible. It only took me around 45 minutes to fill in the initial survey and 10 minutes a month to do the follow-up. So it really isn't a very time-consuming commitment, and it's got the potential to uncover some vital clues to help defeat this virus in the long term and help us all get back to normal.
Thanks, Bill. And I'd also like to ask you, what's one question that you most want the Covidence UK study to answer?
Well, as I said, it's a 5-year study, but I was just wondering, if as the study progresses and feedback from the public is collated, if a particular intervention appears to be obviously beneficial to people's health, is there some flexibility in a study to start immediate trials on something like that?
Thanks. Thank you for your feedback, Bill. And next we're going to speak to Abdul. And Abdul, I want to ask you the same question. What was your biggest motivation and why did you sign up to the Covidence UK study?
Like Bill said, well, I guess there's a lot happening in the world right now, and it feels like almost overwhelming. Like there's just nothing that you can do as a small person just by yourself. But this felt like a way that I could really actually contribute to trying to make the world get back to normal, I guess. Obviously, the virus is going to be here for quite a while unless we develop some kind of vaccine or some kind of way to get rid of it, but it doesn't look like that's happening. So the fact that we're taking, like Bill said, a holistic approach to try and find out the risk factors, it really felt like a way that I, myself as an individual, could actually help the recovery and try and get things back to normal.
Thank you. And next, I'd like to ask you, if you would have a message for anyone who's not yet but considering signing up, what would you say to them?
I would say to them, it's a 45-minute survey when you begin, and then 10 minutes every single month, and you do actually feel like you are helping everybody in the world right now. this study is going to go a long way to, helping the world. So I definitely think people should get involved, especially people from my background. Like you said, Black and ethnic minority people, we are disproportionately affected, and we need to work out why that is. And if it is something to do with lifestyle factors, then this study is going to be very, very important to, working out why things are the way they are and hopefully getting us back on our feet. So yeah, I definitely urge people to get involved.
Thank you, Abdul. Okay, and that's everything from my side. Adrian, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you, Hayley. So next to speak will be Mohammad Talaei, the statistician working on the study, and he's going to tell us a little bit about how he's been analysing the data, and in particular identifying people who may well have already had COVID. Mohammad.
Thank you, Adrian. Hi, everyone. I'm an epidemiologist, and I had the opportunity to work on the Covidence data. So I would like to take the opportunity to thank everyone who shared their data with us. Okay. As this slide shows, less than 5% of our participants had a swab test for COVID-19. Of those tested, 69 individuals had a positive result, while it was negative in more than half of those who underwent testing. However, as very few people in the study had swab testing, we need to know more about those who probably got the virus and developed symptoms. About 1/3 of Covidence participants reported at least one of the possible symptoms of COVID-19, namely loss of smell or taste, fever, persistent cough, fatigue, diarrhea, abdominal pain, and loss of appetite. We needed to estimate who had probably contracted the virus based on these reported symptoms. Another UK study that has been published recently collected data using a phone app in the peak of the epidemic and analyzed the relation between COVID-19 symptoms and having a positive swab test. They created an equation that estimates how probable it is that a person who develops some of these symptoms has COVID-19. As this slide shows, their equation includes age, sex, skipped meals, fatigue, loss of smell, and persistent cough, but not all clinical symptoms of COVID-19. Being male or having any of these symptoms is coded 1, otherwise 0 in this model. Interestingly, the largest coefficient belongs to loss of smell and taste, which means it is the most predictive symptoms here. This equation produces a score that is transformed into probability of having COVID-19 by some further calculations. We applied this model to the Covidence data and estimated that among those nearly 5,800 participants who filled the questionnaire completely by 27th of May, 539 participants have probably had COVID-19, which is 9.3%. It is worth emphasizing that this estimated outcome, which we have called probable COVID-19, does not include individuals who have had the infections without symptoms. We hope to obtain a more comprehensive and precise estimate of who has had the infection by doing antibody testing in future. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mohammad. And next up is Professor Seif Shaheen, who's a Professor of Respiratory Epidemiology at Queen Mary University. And he's going to tell us about his analysis of risk factors based on the definition of COVID-19 that Mohammad has just described. Seif.
Thank you, Adrian. I hope you can hear me all right. I'm speaking from rural Hampshire and my Wi-Fi has suddenly gone a bit dodgy. I'm going to share with you some preliminary analyses, and I emphasize they are preliminary at this stage. So we know already about factors for you've probably read in the press about studies that have looked mainly at severe disease, hospitalization and mortality. Studies looked at risk factors for having a positive antigen test or swab test amongst people who are presenting with symptoms to hospital. What about risk factors for COVID-19 in the wider community, bearing in mind COVID-19 quite largely? Well, this is where Covidence UK. From Mohammad already about how we have defined probable COVID-19 based on specific symptoms. We've obtained risk factor information from you all from your baseline questionnaire. And we've done statistical analysis whereby we adjust each risk factor for each other in our statistical model in order to tease out which factors might have significant and independent effects. So first of all, we've looked at ethnicity and occupation. As you heard already from Hayley, it's well known now that people from the BAME community have an excess risk of particularly severe COVID-19. So this bar chart here firstly shows the risk comparing non-whites to whites. So this is saying that compared with whites, non-whites have a 58% increased risk of probable COVID. And this does not seem to be explained by either occupation, social background, medical conditions, or overweight in our data. We've also looked at the risk of being a frontline worker. And you can imagine frontline workers are exposed in two ways. Firstly, because of the nature of the work they do, either patient-facing or public-facing jobs, but also because they have to travel to get to work, which increases their risk further. And here you can see that compared with non-frontline workers, key workers have a 70% increased risk of probable COVID-19. We next looked at overweight and physical activity. And again, you've probably heard that obesity seems to be a strong risk factor for severe disease. And you kindly reported your height and weight to us, from which we've calculated body mass index. And the convention is to use a BMI of 25 to decide who is overweight or not overweight. So in our analyses, compared to those who are not overweight, those who are overweight seem to have a 20% increased risk of probable COVID-19. A novel and unexpected finding is that when we looked at vigorous physical activity and compared people who did none with those who do some vigorous activity in the week, there's nearly a 20% reduction in risk, which is an intriguing finding. We also looked at general health. You reported your general health status over the last 12 months. And here you see a nice graded effect. Compared with people who reported excellent health in the last 12 months, you can see there's a steady rise in risk as people's health gets worse. And right at the far end here on the right, people who reported poor health, general health, in the last 12 months have a 125% increased risk of COVID-19 compared to those with excellent health. Finally, we've looked at pre-existing medical conditions, and again, you've, I'm sure, read in the press that people with heart disease, diabetes, asthma, hypertension seem to have more severe COVID. When we looked at heart disease, diabetes, asthma, and COPD, we could not see any increased risk of probable COVID-19. And remember that what we're looking at really is more to do with whether you catch COVID-19 or not in the community, rather than looking at the severe end of the spectrum. However, when we looked at hypertension, surprisingly, we saw that compared to those who don't have hypertension, those who do have this condition have nearly a 30% reduction in risk. This was very unexpected, and we can only speculate at the moment what might be explaining that apparent reduction in risk. Maybe it's telling us something about the treatment that people are on. At the moment, it's far too early to say. All I want to say in terms of the preliminary analyses that we've done so far, just to say, as I think Mohammad alluded, we hope in the near future to do antibody testing in the cohort. That will obviously give us a more accurate estimate of who has been infected, and that will include both people with symptomatic infection and people who've had the infection without symptoms. Thanks for listening. Aid, back to you.
Very much, Seif. So I just want to finish off the webinar by addressing some of your questions that you emailed in and talking about next steps. Before I do so, I just want to answer Bill's question about clinical trials. So as we said, Covidence is a platform for clinical trials, and we do have an application for the first one currently under consideration by the Department of Health. And if that's funded, we hope to get going in September. So Eric wrote in with a question. A member of our family, a frontline nurse, reckons she's tested positive for COVID on 3 well-separated occasions. She also says some colleagues have a similar record. If this is correct and common, aren't hopes for any significant COVID immunity pointless? Well, Eric, I think although this phenomenon of asymptomatic carriage, that is, testing positive for the virus in the absence of symptoms, is well recognised, I would be less pessimistic. And I think the reason for that is that there's good data now showing that people who've had SARS-CoV-2, that's the pathogen causing COVID-19, can develop good immunity, both antibody immunity, so these are molecules produced by cells called B cells, which can neutralize the virus, and also T cell immunity. T cells are cells which help the B cells to make antibodies which are protective. So there seems to be a good strong story showing that people who've had serious infection do develop protective immune responses. A $64 million question is how long those might last, and really to get a clue from that we need to look at immunity to other coronaviruses. SARS antibodies were detectable over 1 year in patients who'd been hospitalized for the condition. Another coronavirus infection, MERS, protective responses were seen 4 years later. So I think there are grounds for optimism that a vaccine eventually will be able to stimulate these protective responses, and they will be reasonably long lasting, if not everlasting. Brian asked what effect steroids might have on his ability to fight the virus. He'd read that some people being prescribed steroids to fight the virus and others saying that it lowers the immune system, therefore making it unhelpful. Well, Brian, you have really put your finger on one of the burning questions in COVID research at the moment, which is the role of immunosuppressants. Potentially, of course, they can be double-edged sword. On the one hand, they might dampen immune responses which could protect against the virus, but on the other hand, they might dampen immune responses which we know are responsible for making people ill. When people are sick in hospital with COVID, a lot of the problems are due to an overreactive inflammatory response. Because there's so little certainty on this question, there are actually clinical trials ongoing to try and answer it. I've given you a link here to 2 of them. The first one looks at whether inhaled steroids could prevent COVID infection, and the second one looks at whether in people with mild COVID disease already, whether giving them steroids could improve their outcomes. So we look forward to the results of those studies in due course. Ruth wrote in to ask whether, with the test for antibodies now available, blood samples taken from blood donors could be tested as a matter of course. And I'm pleased to say, Ruth, that Public Health England have been doing this, and here's the results. You can see on the left axis there the proportion of people who've got antibodies to COVID, and you can see it climbing over recent weeks, particularly marked in London. So this is indeed an ongoing surveillance exercise being run by the Blood Donation Service and Public Health England. One question that several people have asked me is how Covidence UK differs to the Zoe C19 app, and I understand that many of you are actually enrolled in both of these studies. So in answer to the question, can I take part in both studies? The answer is yes. These are complementary studies. They're providing different sets of information, and you can certainly take part in both. Just to highlight the details of how the 2 studies differ, the Zoe 19 app is a much larger study, 3.8 million people to date, compared with Covidence was 8,000. The demographic is quite different. So Zoe COVID-19 studies tended to attract younger people, whereas Covidence has attracted older people. And we've already said that that's a big advantage for us because these are the group at highest risk. So if we want to understand risk factors, we need to understand them in the people who really are at the highest risk of getting COVID. The Zoe-19 app asks for daily updates, where we ask for monthly updates only. I think the major difference, one major difference of importance is the amount of information we collect on risk factors. Anybody who's completed our questionnaire will know that it is very detailed. We make no apology for that. We need to get this incredibly granular information in order to work out what the causes and risk factors are in great detail. And I think that's a major focus for us, whereas the the Zoe C19 app provides real-time information on how the epidemic is developing day to day. I think the other major difference is this concept of our study, Covidence UK, being a trials platform. So it's a springboard really for doing trials of interventions that could reduce people's risk. So where are the next steps? Well, as both Mohammad and Seif alluded to, we are planning to take finger prick blood samples. We've got applications for funding for that in process at the moment. And if we're successful, then we'll be sending out little tubes in the post for people to give us 4 to 8 drops of blood, which we can use to test for antibodies and for potential levels of micronutrients like vitamin D. But our other major goal at the moment is to boost enrollment so that we can achieve a sample size of 12,000 or more. Now, you might say you've got 8,000 and that's pretty good going. And I would agree that it's pretty unprecedented to be able to recruit 8,000 people to a detailed epidemiological study like Covidence within a little more than a month. However, let me just illustrate why having more people would be an advantage for the study. And let me illustrate it with an example of a risk factor such as smoking, which might increase risk of COVID, say by 20%. Now, if we just have 6,000 people in the study, you can see here, assuming that 1 in 6 people is a smoker, that would mean that about 12% of smokers compared with 10% of smokers would develop COVID. And if we send those data to Mohammad and he analyzes them for us, he will come back to us and say, yes, there's a trend towards a difference, but it doesn't attain statistical significance. In other words, because the p-value there is greater than 0.05, people could say, well, this is just a chance association, and we don't have strong evidence that smoking is a risk factor. Now let's imagine the scenario where we've got 12,000 participants, so double the number, with the same proportions, 12% risk in smokers, 10% in non-smokers. If we go back to Mohammad and he crunches the data this time, he will come back with the answer that smoking is indeed a risk factor because the chances of that result arising by chance alone are much, much smaller, just 8 in 1,000, as illustrated by the p-value of 0.008. So you can see by achieving our target sample size, we'll have much greater statistical power to pull out risk factors. And that can then lead to public health action, for example, like recommending that people stop smoking to reduce their risk of COVID. The bottom line then, the more participants we have, the greater the power we will have to identify risk factors for disease. So how are we going to go about getting more people on the study? So let me illustrate our strategy by talking about this number R, which I'm sure many of you become familiar with over recent weeks. It stands for the reproduction rate, and it's often used to describe how infectious a virus is. So this is how a virus with an R value of 2 spreads. Patient 0 infects 2 people, and they infect 2 people, and they infect 2 people, and so on, so that the virus grows exponentially through the population. What I want to pose to you is that we have a study with an R equals 2, where 1 participant tells 2 other people, who then tell 2 others, and so forth, so that the growth of the study is similarly exponential. Not only do we need more people, though, we need people from more diverse ethnic backgrounds. And to illustrate this, I've got a table here with 3 columns. On the left, you see the different ethnic groups. In the middle, you see the proportion of the UK population as a whole belonging to those ethnic groups. And on the right, you see the proportion within the study. And what you can see is that people of Asian ethnic origin make up 7.5% of the UK population, but just 2.3% of Covidence UK participants, so they're underrepresented. Similarly, people of Black, African or Caribbean ethnic origin make up 3.3% of the UK population, just 0.7% of Covidence UK participants. So we're particularly trying to reach out to people within these ethnic groups who are at higher risk of COVID, to encourage them to sign up so that our study can represent people of all ethnic backgrounds equally according to their distribution in the population. So how can you spread the word? If you're minded to, we'd be very grateful if you could spread the word by word of mouth. A personal recommendation really counts for a lot. If you can spread it to your followers on social media, be it Twitter, Facebook or Instagram, we know that this is a very effective way of informing people about the study and increasing sign-ups. If you're able to post details of the study on forums or neighbourhood websites, that's also great. And we're also just about to start printing a series of posters and flyers, which can be put up in corner shops, supermarkets, and pharmacies. If you feel that you'd be able to go around your local area and ask local shopkeepers if they'd put one in the window, please do let us know. Drop us a line on covidence@qmul.ac.uk, and we'd be really happy to post some posters and or flyers out to you so that you can spread the word in your community. So we got to the end of the webinar now. Thank you for joining us. I've just got 3 take-home messages. First of all, we've really made a great start with nearly 8,000 people signing up and devoting a considerable amount of time to give us really detailed data, which have already started to provide insights into risk factors for COVID-19. What I am asking for is, if you have got the time and inclination, we'd be really grateful for your help to spread the word, ideally to double our numbers and increase representation in the study from people of Black and Asian ethnic origin. But finally, I would just like to say a big thank you to all of you who've joined the webinar today and who've signed up to Covidence UK. We appreciate your input and we look forward to joining you again in a second webinar in a month's time or so, when we hope to have some new results for you. Goodbye.